Okay, so we're doing something a little bit different today. Typically, we are on our normal Live Now from Fox streaming sites. That means that we're on livenowfox.com, Live Now Fox YouTube account. But today, we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to be streaming for a couple hours. This is going to be an exclusive YouTube stream. And the goal here is to come on for an hour or two and basically discuss October 7th. Today marks 2 years since the terrorist attack that killed over 1,000 Israelis and sparked the Israel-Hamas war that we've been covering almost on the daily here at Live Now from Fox since the war began. My understanding is that it'll take a moment or two for people to begin joining the stream, so we're going to give a little bit of a grace period here, allow people to filter in to the chat. What we're going to be doing today, by the way, and I'll ask our producer Matt if we can go to the question on megaphone so we can ask people to send in more questions if that's possible. What we're going to be doing throughout the evening is we're going to be showing this. What questions do you have about the Gaza war? The whole point of today is 1 to 2 hours of an educational piece, if you will. What do you need to know about the war? What do you need to know about the history of everything we've been discussing? And what do you need to know about how to think about these things moving forward? We're doing this stream at a pertinent time where ceasefire negotiations are developing in Egypt. Some have said, in fact, I was talking with Hal Kempfer over the weekend, and he said that the optimism that some are feeling right now about the potential to hit some sort of path to peace, it's bigger than ever, perhaps. So lots to discuss. Dr. Alon Burstein is going to be joining me for the majority of the time we do this stream. The Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's Cliff May also going to be discussing the 2-year mark with me. He'll be joining us a little bit later on in the hour. And then Hal Kempfer is going to be joining me later on as well. Our first guest here is Dr. Alon Burstein. He has joined me almost on the nightly to discuss the Israel-Hamas war. We discuss pretty much anything from the biggest of the biggest pictures to the smallest of the minute updates that we cover basically on the nightly. Alon has an encyclopedic knowledge of all this stuff. As we sit here, 2 years removed from the October 7th attack, what type of discussion do you feel is most important to have on a day like this?
Good to see you, Austin, and it is good to be summarizing what has been happening in the last 2 years. I mean, there's various different ways that we can look at this anniversary, October 7th and the launching of the war. One of them could be, looking at what is happening right now. Right now, we are in a very critical moment when it comes to actually discussing the future of the war. Are we going to have continuous fighting? Are we going to have some sort of ceasefire and a return of hostages? Are we going to have a more permanent ceasefire? Or, as some have been talking, specifically the United States president, are we looking actually at a trajectory towards resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? So all that is happening and being discussed theoretically as we speak right now. And obviously that is something that needs to be discussed. 2 years after the war broke out, what is the trajectory for the future? Another thing, though, that's very, very important to discuss is the complexity that this war has sort of embodied. One of the things that you and I have seen time and again when we have reviewed what is happening in the war, what questions people are asking, what's hot in the media, is people tend to focus on a very, very specific angle that's close to their heart. Obviously, a lot of people focus on the hostages, their situation, what's going on there. Other people focus on the death toll in Gaza, how many people are civilians, how many are militants, what is happening there. Others focus on the humanitarian aspects. Others focus on the international pressure, the International Criminal Court. Others talk about, is it genocide or not, talk about starvation, the West Bank, and we haven't even talked about the regional, Iran, Lebanon, Hezbollah. People tend to focus on each one of these things as though it's the most important. And the fact is, every one of them is intertwined with the other. You cannot understand the issue of the hostages without understanding Palestinian prisoners. Understanding both sides does not mean that you equate them. Has nothing to do with a moral evaluation, but what Hamas is demanding is associated with Palestinian prisoners. You have to be able to look at, okay, what are they demanding? What do they want? Similarly, when it comes to the humanitarian situation in Gaza, the humanitarian situation is tied very much to international law in Israel, also tied very much to Hamas stealing humanitarian aid. You cannot disassociate any one of these things from the other. And unfortunately, that's one of the things that's also part of the ongoing negotiations right now. The idea that the negotiations are going to be about releasing all the hostages within 72 hours, and that's it, we're now going to just continue on, that can't be disassociated from how many Palestinian prisoners will be released and which ones. What's going to happen with an Israeli withdrawal or not? How does this relate to the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority? So, really, unfortunately, what do we need to talk about is everything. But the first message that I'm going to give out, that is probably going to be something that I repeat when it comes to answering people's questions, is none of these things can be viewed in its own little bubble. Everything is tied to every other aspect in the war.
So, the name of the game today is to send audience questions, to use your questions and pose them to our analysts and experts. John in New York sending this in. How is the relationship between President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu? Does President Trump agree with the way Netanyahu is handling the war with Hamas? Simple question alone. How do you take it?
So, that relationship has been very fluid and changed over time. And we saw this happen also during the first Trump administration. When Trump was first elected and came into office in 2016, Netanyahu really threw his weight into befriending him and did a very good job. Now, they had something in common. They both really disliked Obama at that time. So they had something in common to build on that. And Netanyahu really tried to sort of rally Trump into his way of seeing the Middle East, his way of seeing Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, and Iran. And they worked together very much. But over time, and especially towards the end of the first Trump term, that relationship started to sour. It started to sour a little bit. Trump wanted Netanyahu to be more active when it came to the Abraham Accords, as they were just starting in 2020. And Netanyahu was a little bit pinned with his political situation. Then there was also disagreement between the two of them on how to handle COVID. And also, Trump was furious with Netanyahu because Netanyahu called Biden and congratulated him on his victory in the elections. And Trump said this is a betrayal. He was still saying that the elections were stolen. And then the relationship went sour for a few years. Leading up to the previous election rounds, Netanyahu worked very hard to befriend Trump again, and they seemed to again start to agree on things. Netanyahu has been the one who has been to the White House, the international leader, has been to the White House more than anyone else since Trump returned to office. And that relationship at the beginning was it was very friendly. It was very friendly. They seemed to like each other. They spoke the same language. They constantly heaped praises on each other. And I would say that the height of their cooperation is in the attack on Iran. Leading up to the attack on Iran, the White House was screaming that Israel should not launch any attack on Iran, and Israel was saying we'll do it no matter what. And then when the attack was launched on June 12th, it actually came out that that was part of a coordinated effort that Israel and the United States had been working together in order to fool Iran and sort of lower their defenses, with the United States pretending to say we're not going to allow you to attack, but actually behind the scenes agreeing to the attack. So that I'd say was the height of their cooperation. Right now, over the last month, the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu has soured. It soured primarily because of Israel's failed assassination attempt in Qatar. At the beginning of September, Trump was pushing for a more limited deal. It wasn't the 20-point plan to end the war, it was a more limited deal. And the Hamas leadership had agreed to try to actually see if they're going to adhere to it. And they were under pressure by Qatar to try to adhere to it. And Israel had an assassination attempt in Qatar, in Doha, while they were trying to discuss Trump's plan. Trump was furious. Just a few days ago, Trump reposted on Truth Social an article from the New York Times that said that he was so angry with Netanyahu over that attack, and that's the reason that he decided to basically force Israel into a move of ending the war. He no longer trusts Netanyahu and the trajectory that he's going. So that's what's being published right now. I honestly can say, because of what happened with Iran, I don't trust only the public publications at this point, because it seemed then in June that Israel and the United States were not agreeing. And actually, there was a coordinated way to try to fool Iran that came out. So at this point, the relationship does not look good. Netanyahu is really being coerced by Trump into agreeing to something that he does not really want to agree to. But again, maybe this is a coordinated move between them, but publicly, their relationship right now is at a much worse position than it was a few months ago.
So, Alone, you've done media interview after media interview throughout the course of this war. What do you feel like isn't discussed enough? What question do you wish you would get asked more often on television?
Well, honestly, it depends on how long the interviews are. because very often interviews are short and then complex questions you can't really get into. Um, Something that I think people don't give enough attention to is where Gaza sits with regards to the larger Israeli Palestinian conflict. Because everyone looks at the situation between Israel and Hamas as though it is its own dynamic. Israel has now invaded Gaza. It's vowed to destroy Hamas. Hamas has vowed to destroy Israel. The Gaza Strip was under siege since 2007. But there are two things that are being forgotten. One is the West Bank and the rest of the Palestinian population. Palestinian population in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, and also more broadly in the world, but I'll say with regards to the conflict in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, are not disassociated from one another. Palestinians in the West Bank are just as much Palestinians as Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And I often tell people, if you can feel very connected, if you happen to be Jewish and are very connected to Israel from around the world, or for any other reason are connected to another country, similarly, Palestinians in the West Bank are very connected to what's happening in Gaza. So what's happening in one side has to affect the other, and that's often overlooked. It's overlooked in as much as people think, well, if we just now resolve what's happening in the Gaza Strip, are we resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? We are not. There is the West Bank, and there is a question of what happens. How do these two territories become one again, or maybe they don't? But there's some sort of resolution. So that's something I think is often overlooked. A second thing that's often overlooked is how did we get to 2023? Most people, understandably, started following what is happening exactly 2 years ago today, on October 7th, 2023. But how did we get there? How did we actually get to a situation where Hamas is in control of the Gaza Strip? Israel calls it a terrorist organization. Israel refuses to recognize its legitimacy, but also says it was the governing power in Gaza. It negotiated with it, it helped fund it. How did we get there? Those are the questions I think people don't pay enough attention to, and we need to look at history. Much as it seems like, okay, you're an academic, you like history, that's all well and good. If we don't understand how we got to where we were, we're not going to be able to avoid getting there again. And that's often, unfortunately, the tragedy of these conflicts. We try something, it doesn't work, we forgot, let's just try again, but we're doing the same thing again. You have to try something different. That's where I think people are lost.
Seems like a lot of the discussion about what exactly led to the October 7th attack has to do with Saudi-Israeli normalization. Do you agree with that characterization?
I have to say, I know that that's a very popular theory that Hamas wanted to derail the normalization talks with Saudi Arabia. And certainly that was one of the perks that Hamas wanted to achieve in the October 7th attack. But from my research, all of the evidence shows that that was not the reason for orchestrating the October 7th attack. First of all, the October 7th attack had been planned for 2 years, at least. It had been planned, active planning on the ground, not just thought of. Active planning on the ground for at least almost 2 years. That's long before any discussions between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So that was not the reason to begin the plannings of that attack. More concretely, the October 7th attack was not supposed to happen on October 7th. It was supposed to happen, according to Hamas's plan, 6 months earlier on the eve of Passover. That was when they were going to launch the attack. They then saw that the IDF had moved a few tanks to the areas surrounding the Gaza Strip. And they thought, okay, maybe the military knows about our plans. We're not going to launch it now. But again, that was still before the normalization talks with Saudi Arabia. Did they also want, by October, to derail the normalization talks with Saudi Arabia? Absolutely. But I do not think that that was the reason for we're now watching the images of the kidnappings of October 7th, if anyone's wondering what we're watching. And that was not the reason for the attack. It's hard to find one reason, one singular reason for the October 7th attack. A lot of people point to the fact that Hamas simply are a jihadi organization that aspire for Israel's destruction. First of all, that is true to some extent. They are a jihadi organization, but they're also a Palestinian organization. And there is a difference between different organizations within Gaza and how they view Israel. Hamas does not recognize Israel's right to exist and doesn't want to destroy it, but it's not as radical as ISIS or even the Palestinian Islamic Jihad within Gaza. So one of the reasons is certainly they simply want to attack Israel because that is part of the ideology of destroying Israel piece by piece. But I will also say, even in Hamas's internal documents, there was no illusion that the October 7th attack was going to destroy Israel. There was no illusion that they were going to take over Israel and that this is going to be the final victory. What they did want to achieve is a major stepping stone towards positioning themselves in a place of strength vis-a-vis Israel, breaking the siege on Gaza that Israel had been imposing since 2007, and also forcing the release of thousands of Palestinian prisoners in order to become stronger in the West Bank. The West Bank is not under Hamas's control. The West Bank, the other part of the Palestinian territories, is most of it under Israeli occupation, some of it under the control of the Palestinian Authority. Hamas wanted to make a move to position itself to be stronger within the West Bank as well. So all those things come together. Hamas's ideology, which is an ideology of destroying Israel, Hamas's desire to release Palestinian prisoners, alongside a much more realpolitik ideology of making themselves stronger in order to take over the West Bank soon in the future. One more thing I'll say that's often overlooked: October 7th did not go the way Hamas planned. It went much better for Hamas. They, again, according to their internal documents of what they were planning, in their wildest fantasies, they did not expect to succeed as much as they succeeded. They did not expect to kidnap as many people as they kidnapped, not expect to kill as many people as they killed. I'm not saying that they weren't happy that they did, but the whole planning of the way it was supposed to happen, they did not plan for this the last 2 years. They planned for the attack to be a more focused attack. They were going to kidnap as many people as they could, but actually take over a few towns in Israel, and they wanted to negotiate from there. They thought that they would be able to contain the attack and then negotiate while holding a couple of Israeli towns and kibbutzim. And theoretically, if that would have happened, then they would have been, by the end of 2023, the war would have ended and they would have been in a much stronger place than they were at the beginning of October of 2023. So that was their vision. It didn't go as planned, ironically, because they succeeded much more than they anticipated, producing a much bigger war.
We're getting a question in from Brian from Auburn. He asks, what role are international actors like the United States, Egypt, and Qatar playing currently in Gaza, and how are their interventions influencing the situation? That's an incredibly pertinent question, specifically this week alone.
So there's two different ways that international actors are intervening in Gaza specifically. There's many more ways that they intervene in the war, but two different ways that they intervene in Gaza. One, specifically the actors that were mentioned, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, are very, very involved on the international diplomatic level. They are the ones who are negotiating the ongoing deals, whether it was the different hostage deals until now or possibly now Trump's 20-point plan. They're the ones that each of them have a role in influencing the different sides. The United States has the role of influencing Israel. And we've seen certainly under Trump, the United States is not afraid to use a carrot and stick with Israel also, saying we're going to help fund your war and give you international legitimacy. But at the same time, if you do not go along with what we see as the right thing, we may have to end up using the stick. No bigger example than this would then when, after there was already an agreement brokered between the United States and Iran, Israel had sent planes to carry out another bombing attack, and Trump publicly on TV got on and said Israel called the planes back, and Israel did in midair. So there is that influence of the United States on Israel. Egypt and Qatar exerting a lot of influence on Hamas. That is their role in the negotiations. So that's on the diplomatic level. At the same time, when it comes to, because the question is specifically currently in Gaza, there is also a lot of international intervention that happens in Gaza itself. The main actor is the United Nations. The United Nations and the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, UNRWA, that play a major role in distributing humanitarian aid, running clinics, setting up soup kitchens, setting up shelters, doing all kinds of things, coordinated with Israel. Israel also heavily accuses them of cooperating with Hamas. Then there's also other international actors that provide different aid. Jordan has field hospitals. Their own soldiers have sent medics to Gaza with Israel's approval to set up field hospitals. Egypt has now sent in a bunch of heavy equipment to start clearing rubble. Again, all this has Israel's approval. Without Israel's approval, nothing can happen in Gaza. So on the ground in Gaza, there's a lot of intervention that relates much more to the daily life of Palestinians. But when it comes to the international arena, this is mostly influence on Israel, influence on Hamas, and it's different than the international pressure. International community is very critical of Hamas and wants it to release hostages, certainly very critical of Israel, wants it to stop the war. Here I'm talking about direct influence. Here I'm talking about Qatar saying to Hamas, you better do something or you might be expelled from Qatar. The United States telling Israel, you better do something or we might stop giving you diplomatic aid packages, or sorry, military aid packages or diplomatic support. So that's how the different international actors are influencing the war.
One thing hearing a lot is, and you know what? We got another question in from Brian, by the way. While we're talking about
Right.
Brian, let's ask another question. Let's get another question in from Brian in Auburn. We appreciate you, Brian, for sending in a couple questions. A couple of good questions. What's happening with civilian displacement, and how many people are still unable or unwilling to leave conflict zones? Two good questions. Many people have been displaced several times, but also, if you can expand on the idea of how common is it for people to be unwilling to move from these areas?
So I'll say two things. I'm going to assume that the question relates to Gaza. That's where
Yeah.
we've had the mass displacement. But it is also important to remember that throughout the war, there have been hundreds of thousands of people that were internally displaced within Israel, from northern Israel and from the areas surrounding Gaza. It's just a facet that people often overlook. And some might say, well, rightly so, because the internal displacement in Israel is not going to bombed out refugee camps. It's going to other areas the government facilitates. But when people talk about displacement, I just say it's always important to remember all sides. When it comes to the displacement in Gaza, the Gaza Strip, I'm going to give a little bit of background. The Gaza Strip is a very, very small area. The entire Gaza Strip is 141 square miles. That is about a third of the size of New York, about a quarter of the size of Los Angeles. So within that territory, that's very small, 2.2 to 2.3 million people, Palestinians, had been living prior to the war breaking out. So within Gaza, being internally displaced, first of all, does not mean that you get to go very far away from conflict zones. It's always about 10, 20, 50 miles south or north. When the war started, Israel ordered, through the United Nations mechanism, the complete evacuation of the areas known as northern Gaza and Gaza City. Israel said, where this area is going to become an active fighting zone, all Palestinian civilians should leave. Anyone who stays behind is willingly choosing to stay in a conflict zone. And Israel did this very publicly in order to adhere with all kinds of international laws. That said, Hamas at that point was also threatening people, saying, don't leave. We don't want you to leave this. We don't want to make Israel's job easy when it comes to targeting militants. We want Israel to have a hard time because we're blended into the civilian population. So during that time, despite Hamas's efforts, almost 1 million people, half of the population, became internally displaced and moved southward in the Gaza Strip to the areas of Han Yunis and Rafah. Then, 6 months later, the fighting started to go south in the Gaza Strip. Israel invaded Han Yunis and then several months later invaded Rafah. And people were again internally displaced. By now, we have the internal displacement of another, give or take, 30% of the population of Gaza. And those 50% that had moved south, again, now had to relocate to areas in refugee camps in the Al Muasi refugee zone. That zone that at that point had been housing about 85% of the population of Gaza, prior to the war, had about 20 to 30,000 people. All of a sudden, it has 1.8 million people. That is one of the reasons for the humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. It is impossible to accommodate 1.8 million refugees in a refugee camp that is used to having several dozen thousand people. Then, after the truce of the beginning of 2025, Palestinians for the first time were allowed to come back up north, where Israel said they had to evacuate. And about 800,000 Palestinians made their way back up north to Gaza City, which had mostly been destroyed by this point. Now, as the spiral of fighting resumed in May of 2025, Israel again said it is going to push into Gaza City and called upon people to relocate southward. At this point, a lot of people said, we're done. Hamas also was still telling people not to relocate. A lot of people were saying, we're moving around from bombed out area to bombed out area. It's a fallacy to say that we're going to be protected, and we're just tired of playing this game. That said, when Israel, at the beginning of September, launched a massive bombing campaign in the Gaza Strip, and Israel said that, among others, it is doing that in order to make noise, literally on the ground with bombs, in order to get people to realize that they need to evacuate, some 700,000 people did begin to relocate southward. So people are continuously being internally displaced in the Gaza Strip. Some have argued you shouldn't even call it internal displacement anymore, because to be displaced, you have to have a place that you're actually physically located that you're displaced from. Whereas right now, the entire Gaza Strip, as we're seeing in the pictures, is a lot of it is reduced to rubble. So that's what's happening. There's still a lot of internal displacement. And at this point, a lot of people are either refusing or also unable to continuously move from place to place, leading to further complexities.
So, one question. We're live on YouTube, we're live on TikTok. I just got a question from a user named S on TikTok who asks, and this is a question I get all the time. This is why I'm about to bring this up to you, is because this is one of the most common questions I get from viewers on TikTok specifically, is what's the likelihood that this escalates into a wider regional war? That's still a common concern that a lot of people have. How would you respond to that?
So it really depends, at what point do we call it an escalation to a regional war? Israel has invaded Lebanon, and we've had 22,000 rockets and missiles fired from Lebanon and Syria by Hezbollah into Israel. That's already part of the region. Israel's also taken over parts of southern Syria after the fall of the Assad regime, out of fear that there's going to be a cascade of civil war in Syria that'll threaten Israel. Israel has carried out attacks in Iran. Iran has carried out attacks in Israel. Yemen, Houthis have carried out attacks in Israel, and Israel has retaliated. So many would argue this is a regional war. This is already a war that is engulfing the entire region. Again, I just mentioned, Lebanon, Syria, Iran. There's also been attacks in Iraq and Yemen. 5 different countries in the Middle East, including, if you add Israel, 6 different countries in the Middle East already that have exchanged fire, missiles, airstrikes, etc. during these 2 years. So some would argue it already is a regional war. Others would say no, you can actually look at a war breaking out when it is armies colliding. What happened between Israel and Iran was a war. Before that, firing missiles randomly and Israel firing bombs randomly, that's not a war between the sides. So if we were to look at the dangers of this escalating towards militaries clashing in the Middle East, I'll say that there have been several times throughout the last 2 years that has seemed more likely. We've seen a substantial deterioration of the relationship between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan, so much so that we've had Egypt building up forces, sometimes against the peace treaty with Israel in the Sinai Peninsula, and Israel seeing this as a threat. That said, in the current moment, I would say that the chances of that are less likely, mostly because of the United States. With Trump in the White House, people know, leaders know, that Trump, there's a lot that can be said about him for better and for worse, and I'm sure all the viewers have both better and worse to say. But one of the things that is consistent about him, ironically, is that he's unpredictable and that he's very emotional. It's something I've said to you, Austin, many times. He is unpredictable, so he could be looking at an alliance and see the benefits in it, but then get insulted or see that the people aren't living up to their word as far as he's concerned and decide he's turning away from that alliance. That's not how it usually works in diplomacy. Diplomacy usually is above being so unpredictable. But we have seen that on the one hand, he's very unpredictable, and he's also very emotional when things that we see this with the hostages. He is so dedicated, at least publicly, but seemingly also in truth, to getting the hostages back. But this is because that happened to touch his heart. There's lots of tragedies in the world that haven't touched his heart. Given that, it is very unlikely that Arab countries would risk an escalation militarily with Israel at this point, seemingly because they would be afraid of a possible reaction from Trump that they would not be able to expect. In the same vein, I'll just end with this. In the same vein, Israel is also less likely to launch such campaigns after the fiasco of what happened with Qatar. Israel launched this attempted assassination in Qatar. Not only did it fail, not only did it seemingly bring Trump to compel Israel to accept this deal, Trump has also now given Qatar a military alliance that is, right now, Qatar is closer militarily to the United States, far more than Israel is. So that is a big failure as far as Israel was concerned. I'd say both sides right now are less likely to go on, I'll say, adventures militarily at this point.
As today marks 2 years since the October 7th attack, we've been seeing demonstrations across the world, including in Tel Aviv and here stateside in New York City. We understand that this is a celebration of life for Jewish people taking place at Central Park as we speak. This is a live look at what's happening there. I've seen a number of people wearing T-shirts saying, "Bring them home." Um, Alone, I know something that you study is not only Israeli-Palestinian affairs, but also demonstrations. Talk to me about what the role of protests, demonstrations have been around the world. There's been a number of save the hostage type of rallies, almost on the weekly in Tel Aviv. There's been a number of demonstrations across the United States, across the world, really. We saw the flotilla story that we've been tracking for the past week. When you think of all the different ways that demonstrations have worked into the past 2 years, what's your analysis of how much of a tangible impact it's had on the war itself?
I'd say that demonstrations have had a very big impact each time on their local respective governments. So they haven't had a big impact on what's happening in the war. Looking at this demonstration now that's happening in New York, or looking at pro Palestine events that have happened also in New York and in Europe, neither one of them are going to impact Hamas or Israel to think, I am going to act differently. But the more there is local disruption of routine, the more there's protests in places from Australia to Europe to different parts of the United States to Canada to Latin America, the more this becomes a matter that is bothering, and I use that term deliberately, that is bothering local politicians, that we're seeing questions about what does the mayor of New York, the now upcoming elections, have to say about the Israel and Hamas and Gaza. The mayor of New York, forgive me, should not care about what's happening in Gaza. He has to, or she has to, govern New York. But once protests are happening, once this becomes a local event, then it starts to spiral upwards towards the local governments. And I am not saying that the different governments that have intervened in the war between Israel and Hamas, either through support or critique or whatever, I'm not saying that the leaders don't genuinely care. I'm saying that they would care a lot less if this wasn't something that ended up having political currency in their own respective countries. Some of the countries have been most critical of Israel, Ireland, Spain, and again, there's a plethora of others, but let's just use those two as an example. The fact that their population seems to care, that this has become a local political event, is what drives Spain today was supposed to vote on a weapons embargo of Israel. Again, I'm not saying that the leadership of Spain does not care genuinely what's happening in Gaza. I'm saying if this was not something that was seemingly influencing college campuses, different places of work, influencing the population within their country, they would not be as involved. So, do the protests matter in terms of what's happening on the ground? Almost absolutely not. At the same time, do they matter for the local politics that then filter up? Again, I take New York as an example. I'm just constantly, forgive me, laughing at the questions of what does the future mayor of New York think about the war. I don't want the mayor of New York to be thinking about the war. I want them to be thinking about New York. That's how they should be evaluated. So that's where protests have had an influence.
So we do have Cliff May. He's the president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He's joining us. And Cliff, it looks like you might be on mute there. Just want to make sure that we can hear you and you can hear us.
Still on mute.
Yeah, so what's going on here?
And now I'm off mute. There we go.
There he
Okay,
is.
so
All
my
right.
screen,
Cliff
sorry.
May, the president of the FDD, is on with us here. We're kind of going with the flow here. We're going to be talking for a good amount of time. Cliff, nice enough to give us about a half hour of his time as we discuss an important day, today marking 2 years since the October 7th attack. I want to ask you a question that I asked Alone earlier in the hour, Cliff. You've done an incalculable amount of media interviews about this war. What question do you wish people would ask more often over the last 2 years?
Over the last 2 years, gosh, I think they should ask, what is this conflict about? Because I think many people don't understand it. For years, people thought this conflict could be settled with a land for peace solution. But of course, the Israelis left Gaza in 2005 to test the land for peace solution. If the problem was that the Israelis are in Gaza, we'll leave and things will get better. Didn't work out that way because 2 years later, Hamas had taken over violently, I might add. And what happened after that, after 2007? Well, a few things. One is that the international donor community poured huge amounts of money into Gaza, and the UN provided social services, healthcare, education, whatever was needed. And they did so according to whatever rules Hamas laid down, and they didn't complain. But it's also true that a two-state solution doesn't make sense if you understand the problem. And what's the problem? For Hamas, Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood organization. Hamas has a charter. That charter says that Israel will exist until Islam, not Palestinians, Islam obliterates it. So you need to know a little history to understand all this. You need to know that in the 7th century, a Muslim army sprang out of Arabia, conquered much of the civilized world, going all the way west to Morocco, up into Spain, going east in the other direction through Persia, what is now Pakistan. It wasn't Pakistan then. It was quite amazing. But this was an empire. It was a settler colonialist empire. And most of the ethnic and religious groups it conquered and dominated either died out or they today live as what might be called dhimmis, if they still exist, which means second-class citizens. I'm thinking of the Berber Christians. I'm thinking of the Coptic Christians of Egypt. All kinds of groups. There's one group that refused, one ethno-religious group that refused to follow the script, and that's the Jews in 1948, the end of the Age of Empires. The British left, had the Ottomans, they had left, they had been defeated in World War One. They decided we are going to rule ourselves. And if you're Hamas, that is intolerable and unacceptable because any land ever conquered by a Muslim army becomes for eternity an endowment, a waqf from Allah to the Muslims that jihad must be fought to regain it. Now, that's the question that hasn't been asked. That's the question I'm answering because, Austin, we have the time to do so. And on a quick radio interview, it's pretty hard to get that into a 30-second soundbite.
You know, Cliff, and Alone, has the way, and I'll pose this to Alone since Cliff brought up the two-state solution, has the way we think about a two-state solution changed over the past 2 years?
I mean, it's one thing that I was asked immediately on October 8th of 2023, like, how are we looking at it at the two-state solution? And I said, listen, on the one hand, seemingly, we are farthest away from a two-state resolution than we maybe ever have been. I mean, the two states, after the partition of Palestine that was voted on in the United Nations in 1947, the concrete two states between Israel and Palestinians had been talked about since 1980s, more concretely since 1990s. And there were times that it looked closer, there were times that it looked further. Now, seemingly, it looks much further. At the same time, and I told this to people already, October 8th, I remember that interview, and it seemed, things were spiraling up, and I had no idea where it was going to go. I did not think it would go this far, but I had no idea where it was going to go. And I said, at the same time, there is a repeated pattern in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that is nothing changes. We have status quo, and nothing changes until there are massive spirals of violence, and those produce a change. They don't always produce a change towards peaceful resolutions or two states, but they produce a change. The Israeli military had occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip since 1967, and it was status quo for 20 years. A Palestinian intifada, uprising with violence, changed that. We had the Oslo Accords in 1993. The sides shook hands trying to get to a two-state resolution. That came crashing down in the year 2000, and we had a second Palestinian intifada, massive violence, that produced, as Cliff just said before, Israel's pullout from the Gaza Strip. Neither one of those was necessarily a successful resolution, but it was something that if you ask someone in 1990, is Israel going to shake hands with the Palestine Liberation Organization, with Yasser Arafat, they would have laughed at you. What are you talking about? We're in the midst of the biggest spiral of violence until now. 3 years later, that happened. In 2002, 2003, Ariel Sharon is elected to become prime minister of Israel. He is, at that point, Israel's most hawkish figure. He is the father of the settlement program. Anyone tells you within 2 years Israel will be evacuated from Gaza, they would have laughed at you. That happened then. To ask now, are we closer or further away from a two-state resolution? At this point, yeah, people should laugh if they say, yes, you're closer, or you're looking at that in any realistic way. What I tell people is, yes, but similarly, we would have laughed in 1990, we would have laughed in 2003. There is going to be a change. It is very unlikely that we're going to, at the end of this war, however it concludes, that we're going to just go back to the way things were on October 6, 2023. I don't know if that change will lead towards a two-state resolution. It may lead towards a one-state Israel annexing the West Bank, and who knows what happens in Gaza. But there's probably going to be some change in the trajectory. That's all I'll say.
So let's bounce back to Cliff here. And by the way, Cliff, pretty much the name of the game today is to show questions from our viewers and pose them to you guys. John from Seebeck asking, who's going to be responsible or take on the task for the cleanup and reconstruction of Gaza when this ends? How much clarity do we have on that question today?
Well, a little bit, I would say. In this, it depends on what you mean by who's going to clean it up. First of all, it's going to cost a fortune, right? Who can write the checks for that? Well, I would say we kind of know who are the rich nations in that region who might be willing to do it. The Saudis, the Emiratis, possibly the Qataris, though we can discuss why that may be problematic. But it's going to be the oil-rich nations of the Middle East. I don't see anybody else coming up with the cash for that. Who will actually clear the rubble? Who will actually build the new buildings? There'll be bids for that. The Turks might like to do that. Turks are very good at that sort of thing. They could use the income. There may be Europeans who want to do that. I don't know who else might do it, but it's something that can be done. Look, President Trump has talked about how he could make Gaza into a Riviera in the Eastern Mediterranean. Maybe he knows some companies that want to bid. I can see him saying, I'd like American firms to clear the rubble and build the new buildings, as long as someone else, again, maybe the Saudis, maybe the Emiratis, maybe the Qataris, are picking up the bills.
I'll also just add to that, it's not in the 20-point plan, but it's alluded to in the 20-point plan. And several weeks ago, the Trump administration put out not an official, but an unofficial document that was being discussed with regards to the economic rebuilding of Gaza. And like Cliff said, it envisions, on the one hand, massive investments of Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, but it mostly envisions the United States coming in to rebuild the area. There's the Elon Musk AI Center, there's smart cities. I mean, this plan is pretty elaborate in the way it envisions things. I don't know how realistic it is for the Gaza Strip, but the way it tries to view them is as an investment opportunity. It says we want investors to come in. It talks about the United States taking over the Gaza Strip for 10 years and being given the land by Israel and buying out Palestinians and rebuilding it in a different way, but it's explicit again and again, very much in the way Trump likes to look at things, but not with American money. It's going to be with regional money, but American supervision. The 20-point plan does not talk about that specifically, but alludes to that enough to make me think that that's somewhere in the background of what Trump might be thinking.
We're looking at a live vantage point of Gaza. This camera is planted in southern Israel, overlooking a portion of the Gaza skyline. The time, Israel Standard Time, approaching 15 minutes to midnight. Our next question coming in from Frank in Lewisburg. He says, will the main corridor that Hamas got all the weapons from be held by Israel? Cliff, I think this is a decent question because a lot of people know, and we've discussed it at length over the last 2 years, the connection between Iran and Hamas. And there's always been a question as to how they built the tunnels, where they got all of that infrastructure from, where they got the weapons from. Can you clarify where they got all that from? And what's the common line of thinking about how to prevent something like that from happening in the future?
Yeah, well, I think what he's referring to is what's called the Philadelphia corridor. It's in the south. It's the border with Egypt. I think that for the foreseeable future, there will be Israeli troops on that border. What had happened over the years, and the Israelis seem to not be as aware of it as they should have been, that weapons were coming in from Egypt, either overland or through many tunnels underneath, perhaps most likely both. And I think that that will be stopped. I think there was a view that the Egyptians wouldn't allow that to happen. They did. Why did they allow that to happen? Even though we know that the Egyptians don't much like Hamas, can't tell you. Maybe it was smuggling, maybe it was bribery, maybe Hamas said, "We'll lay off you, the president of Egypt, as long as you let us get weapons into Hamas." we can be a problem for you. After all, the Muslim Brotherhood has been a problem for the Egyptian government in the past, all those things. So I do think that the Israelis are going to say we need for the foreseeable future to patrol the Philadelphia corridor between Gaza and Egypt.
Alone, is it the Philadelphia corridor, or are there other ports, other entryways that people focus on?
So the Philadelphia corridor is in fact that border between Gaza and Egypt. It's basically a line, a strip of land. We're seeing now blasts going off in Gaza, also
Yep.
like just in the skyline. Um,
Can you maybe
it's
show us
that
on your
it's
map
basically an
where the
area.
corridor is, Alone?
Sorry.
Can you maybe show us on your map where the corridor is?
So this is looking at Gaza, and this is Israel, and this is the border between Gaza and Egypt. The Philadelphia corridor runs alongside this border. So it's just in the Gazan side. It's not the border itself, but it's, a couple feet into the border, basically. And it's an area that Israel, since 1967, had created, and primarily since 1982, when Israel gave back Sinai to Egypt, Israel had created in order to create this buffer zone, create a zone between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. And there were a lot of tunnels that were going under it. As part of Israel's evacuation in 2005, there were deals between Israel and Egypt, how Egypt would patrol it. Egypt did build a very elaborate underground blocking of a lot of the tunnels in recent years. Part of the problem, and I will say, in answer to your question, Austin, no, there aren't a lot of other land crossings because all the others are controlled by Israel, and Israel also controlled the sea and the air. But something that is just often overlooked is, I'll say, to some extent, regrettably, in your ability to control this, most of Hamas's weaponry are manufactured in Gaza. A lot of it is smuggled in, but the vast majority of weaponry has been manufactured over the years in Gaza as a result of smuggling in materials, as a result of different shady deals that are done with different agencies, and as a result of money that came into the Gaza Strip, a lot of money from Qatar, which Israel asked Qatar to give Hamas, and Hamas used it to manufacture these weapons, the tunnels. How did Hamas build all those tunnels? Where did they get the concrete from? That was bought with Qatari money that Israel funded in, and then Hamas used it to make weaponry. Israel has been time and again been taking over weapons manufacturing plants in the Gaza Strip. As much as last week, Israel took over a new manufacturing plant to make missiles and rockets in Gaza, in northern Gaza. And when I saw that, I caught my head and I was like, wait a minute, Israel took over the Gaza city. It had been there for a year. Hamas was able to re-infiltrate there in January. We're now in October. They've rebuilt factories and plants in order to build rockets currently in the Gaza Strip. So chances are, I agree with Cliff, that Israel will maintain that border. That is not enough to stop weaponry from being in the Gaza Strip.
Cliff, what's our understanding of what type of blasts? There was reporting to suggest that the IDF has moved to a strictly defensive position. Do we know what exactly is going on? Because we see blasts taking place in real time. Do we know what the current state of the battlefield is?
Allah may know better, but my understanding is the following. The IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, are fairly deep into Gaza into Gaza City, not just in Gaza. Probably Israeli Defense Forces control, I don't know, maybe 70% of Gaza. Generally speaking, if Alon has a different number, I defer to him. I think they're circling Gaza City, which is really the last major stronghold of Hamas in the tunnels underneath predominantly. I think that President Trump has said while these negotiations are going on, the Israelis should hold back. They won't hold back entirely. If they're shot at, they'll return fire, but they're not moving ahead. I think what we've heard both from Prime Minister Netanyahu and from Eyal Zamir, the chief of staff of the army, is that if these negotiations go well, that's great, and we won't push ahead. But if they fall apart, we're coming in very strong, and we are going to root out Hamas from the tunnels, and we will destroy them once and for all. So, by the way, I think this is interesting, Austin and Alon. Imagine you are a Hamasnik in one of those tunnels right now. I think you have to be pondering, what do I want to do? I can release the hostages, and the Israelis guarantee that they will let me go safe passage to a third country. I'll get to live, and if I want, fight another day. Or maybe it's my religious duty to die a martyr and be celebrated on the Arab street and on Columbia University's campus and every place else that Islamists and leftists celebrate Hamas. What should I do? I think it's kind of a conundrum if you are a Hamasnik in those tunnels. And I don't know exactly what you're hearing from Qatar or from the Hamas leaders who live very well in Doha in five-star hotels and dine out. I Are they now advising it's time to give up the hostages? We're going to go with this deal that Trump has proposed. Qatar is behind it, Turkey's behind it, Egypt's behind it, the Emiratis are behind it, the Saudis are behind it. Do it. Meanwhile, my guess is, and again, I want to hear a lot on this, that Hamas negotiators will try to drag out, say yes, but say maybe we can get you a couple of hostages out, but I don't know if we can find them all. I think they'll try to string Trump along, and they'll try to drag out the negotiations as long as they can, and see if patience wears out or not.
Alone, what are we hearing on the battlefield?
So, with regards to the current lines that are held by the IDF is actually even further than Cliff said. According to the Israeli military, they're holding on to 85% of the Gaza Strip. And there's one more thing I want to say. Gaza City that we're talking about is really this area over here. However, there is another stronghold. I do have to say, the Gaza City is not the last stronghold. The Israeli military has yet to actually enter into the central parts of Gaza, the areas of Deir al-Balah, the Nusirat area, Al Bureij, all of these regions that are in the central parts of the Gaza Strip. Israel has not invaded on the ground with ground forces so far in the war. Some have speculated that that is because there's an estimate that that is where the majority of the hostages were held, and Israel did not want to target those areas. Possibly, possibly not, but that is a fact. There's still the central camps. Even if Gaza City was completely taken over and purged, there's still the other big city, Deir al-Balah, in the central parts of the Gaza Strip. In terms of what those blasts are on the ground, different forces are reporting different things. Israel did say that it is going to halt the bombing very publicly. Trump, again, sort of signaling what you asked me before, or the question that was asked before about the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu. Netanyahu publicly said that Israel needs to stop the bombing. Didn't say that quietly. Said very, very publicly. Israel learned about that through the media. And then, responding very, very publicly, the Israeli military said, we've been ordered by the government to, in fact, stop the actual advancing on the ground. It said, but we are still going to carry out defensive operations for our troops on the ground. That is a messy situation. Troops on the ground are street fighting with Hamas. So what does it mean to carry out defensive operations? If you're not advancing to the next street over with bombings, that's okay. But then if you're held up in positions and you think that there's a Hamas fighter approaching you because of intelligence or a drone that sees it or something like that, you're going to bomb them 2 streets over. Those are still bombings. So that's still what's going on. Today, there were reports of major airstrikes that happened in the Nusirat refugee camp. And there was even reports of what's called firebelt bombings in the areas of Han Yunis. Han Yunis is the area that's entirely controlled by the Israeli military. So there's firebelt bombings there, and that just means a ring of fire that is very, very intense, usually for the evacuation of forces. Something's going on there. There's still active fighting on the ground. Is Israel adhering to what it promised that it would do and stopping the advancing bombings and just carrying out defensive operations? Maybe, according to sources in Gaza, not necessarily. According to Israel, yes. I'm not in Gaza, so I don't know exactly. I know that as far as is being reported, there are still bombings that are happening, but they're not bombings into the area that the IDF does not control. They're bombings in the areas surrounding the IDF, possibly as what's seen as quote unquote protective measures of the troops on the ground.
Cliff, what are you watching for? We only have you for another 5 minutes or so here. I want to make sure I get you in here. What are you watching for next? Sam from Texas says, is there a guarantee in the treaty as to what will happen if either party breaches it? Where are you looking from here? And if you can, mix in an answer to Sam's question, what happens if we see a major breach on either side?
Well, we don't have an agreement yet. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And I think there's a threshold question. And that threshold question goes back to what I was saying earlier. Will Hamas decide, okay, we are going to give up the hostages? If they don't, it doesn't go further. That's the threshold. That has to happen first. And I believe, again, President Trump can change his mind, but he's made pretty clear the way he's going to do this is not to say, let's have a ceasefire, then let's negotiate, let's see if we can get a few hostages back. No, he's saying, I want the hostages out. And then we will go after everything else. But nothing starts until then. Will there, if you get the hostages back, listen, there will be all kinds of disagreements over how long the Israelis are there. If somebody shoots at an Israeli, does that end the ceasefire? Or will Hamas say, no, that's Palestinian Islamic Jihad? We can't control these guys. We're sorry. Anyhow, what I'm saying is nothing happens unless the hostages are released, and we don't know if that's going to happen at this moment.
Moving forward, one thing that I think is important to touch on is the Palestinian civilians, and the challenges that we've seen from a humanitarian level. Cliff, before we let you go here, where does the discussion stand on what happens with the Palestinian public? A lot of what we're talking about right now is a meeting in Egypt. They're meeting in Cairo as we speak. They're talking about a path forward to release the hostages and then eventually end the war. But what questions do you have, Cliff, about the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians that remain in the enclave?
Two things. Listen, aid has been going in. A lot more aid can go in and can go in and be distributed much more easily. The problem has always been distribution of aid, never the amounts of aid. The amounts of aid have been actually quite large. This, if the conflict ends, it'll be much better. That there's a huge rebuilding effort that going forward. And then there's the whole question of who's going to govern Gaza in the future. We could talk about that for a long time, but they're talking about technocrats. They're talking of, I think there'll be a role, assuming that Hamas no longer has guns and is shooting them, for the kind of moderate and pragmatic Arab states. There may be more of a role for the clans. What I mean by that are the kind of the various families that have for sometimes for centuries been the rulers in various parts of Gaza, but who have been suppressed by Hamas. There have been fights, not getting a lot of media coverage, should get more between some of these clans who don't like Hamas and Hamas. One more thing I will just say, because I think it's important. I do not believe that the people of Gaza are going to love Israelis at the end of this. Of course, they're not. I think the most you can hope for is that a lot of people in Gaza, the vast majority, will say, look at what Hamas brought us. Why? We don't want this to happen again. We'd like to rebuild our lives. Our lives were not so bad before. We are just not going to make the same mistakes with the same rulers again. Don't forget, there have been no elections in Gaza since, remind me, 2005, 2006, probably,
2006.
Alon? 2006. And the UN and all those haven't said we should have some elections. People should have some choice. No, it's been totalitarian Islamist rule by Hamas, which, getting back to what I started to say, does not want a Palestinian state. What they want is an emirate of the coming caliphate. If we understand that, then we can figure out a way forward. If we don't understand that, well, one mistake will follow another.
Cliff May is the president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. He's a busy man. We thank you for being generous with your time today. Take care.
Thanks, Austin. Good to see you, Alon.
Good to see you, Cliff.
Thank you. Okay, Alon's going to stand by with us here, and we do. Let's carry on with the conversation about Hamas. This is a tricky question to answer, but I'd love your take on it. Is there any reliable information out there to suggest just how popular Hamas is within the general Palestinian public?
It's a good question. Is there any reliable information? There's lots of information. Is there any reliable information? It's very tricky. There are surveys that are carried out by different NGOs within the West Bank that also have people that do them in the Gaza Strip. Historically, they have been relatively reliable. The surveyors that they have are relatively reliable, and they have managed to predict a lot of the sentiments within the Palestinian population over the years. However, one of the things that was discovered about 6 months into the war, there were surveys I'll say it differently. Immediately after October 7th, there were surveys that were done with the Palestinian population, how much do you support what Hamas has done in the Gaza Strip? And the results showed overwhelming support for October 7th. About 6 months into the war, or a year into the war, Israel uncovered documents in the tunnels of Gaza that showed that Hamas had completely forged that the surveyors came under Hamas's thumb, and that the results were that 37% of the population or less supported October 7th, and Hamas changed that to 87 supported the attack on October 7th. So there are reliable surveys out there. During the war, I rely on them a lot less. It's a lot harder to actually understand what is the popular support. There were, about a year ago, there started to be protests in the Gaza Strip against Hamas. There were protests, nightly protests in the areas of Sajaiya in northern Gaza and in the areas of the Abbasan regions of Han Yunis. Every night, people were coming out, chanting, calling out. This is a territory with no democratic tradition. This is a territory where protesting is not something common. The fact that people were thinking to go out, make signs in the midst of a war. You're living in these bombed out refugee camps that we're seeing. The people found cardboard to make signs and go out and protest against Hamas and against Israel. Again, these people have no love for Israel as a result of what's happening. But to say Hamas and Israel let us live, both of you, enough with you, the chance we're against Yahya Sinwar and Netanyahu together, that was a big indication of the sentiment on the ground. I will say at the same time, those protests have disappeared. Did Hamas crack down on them, and that's why? Did they just turn more against Israel as a result of what's happening? Or has public sentiment changed? Do not know. I will say that very likely the Palestinian population, like most of the civilian population in war torn areas, want a chance to rebuild their lives and live in security. That said, we have seen in the Israeli Palestinian conflict, what often happens when there's a spiral down of violence is once the guns go silent, everyone's okay, now we can stop thinking about it. But the fact is that Palestinians living under Hamas, besieged by Israel, or in the West Bank under Israeli occupation or the Palestinian Authority, these are not people that are having a good quality of life. The one thing I would disagree with what Cliff said when it came to the fact that until October 7th, the people had a pretty decent life. Actually, unemployment rate in Gaza was about 50%. Gaza had one of the lowest GDPs in the world. So if we get back to what happened before October 7th, that's not really rebuilding Gaza in a way that the civilian population is going to have a chance to thrive. Will it be better for them than living out in bombed out areas like they are now? Certainly. And will we have then a placating of the situation? Very likely. But it's not going to last more than a few years because people end up wanting more for their lives, not just wanting good enough. We've seen this in Egypt, we've seen this in Syria, we've seen this in Afghanistan, we've seen this in Iraq, saying just change the regime and everyone will be happy without actually worrying to how is economic growth then going to happen? What's going to happen to the political culture? What's going to happen to the stability of institutions? That doesn't work. You actually need to invest in growth of an area, not just in changing the government and assuming that everyone's going to just be okay now.
A live look at the Gaza skyline. The time is Real Standard Time, just past midnight. Let's talk about Jim's question here. Jim from Goldsboro sends this in. Why didn't they flood the tunnels like they talked some time back? Let's talk about the tunnels alone. The tunnels felt like a bigger piece of the conversation in the first year or so when we were covering the war. Not that they're not a piece of discussion today, but it feels like a smaller piece of the discussion than it was in the beginning. Tell us about where those tunnels stand today. What do we know at least about what the IDF has been doing with those tunnels? I think there was an effort to send water into the tunnels early on. Do we have any updates that we can share with Jim about where the water operation stands? And then today, where do the tunnels stand largely? Has the IDF destroyed them, investigating them? What do we know?
It's a good observation, both that Jim made about what happened to that plan,
Right.
and what you said. Wasn't this a bigger deal, so to speak, at the beginning of the war? We're constantly talking about that. Both observations are correct. Hamas invested a monumental amount into the development of these tunnels. I got asked very, very colloquially, tongue-in-cheek, with people like, where did Hamas study engineering? Because they have managed to do things underneath Gaza that engineers in the top universities can't figure out. How did they do that? So they invested a hell of a lot into the tunnels in the Gaza Strip. the tunnels were really divided into two different types. One was considered attack tunnels. These are usually relatively small. They're a couple hundred feet, and what they are is under a building, you build a tunnel to store weaponry and basically to hide as an ambush and to use that as an attack mechanism if the IDF is coming in, and many IDF soldiers have been killed as a result of those ambushes. Then there's more what's called strategic tunnels. Those are tunnels that Hamas built for the creation of headquarters to run the war, headquarters to run their operations, places to be protected from bombings. Within those different strategic tunnels, Hamas also has held and likely is currently holding hostages. So those are the two different types of tunnels. When the war started, Israel had, I'll say it bluntly, no idea what is the scope of tunnels in the Gaza Strip. And at first, it was estimated that there are a total of maybe 200 miles of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip. Within a year, Israel had estimated that there are about 400 miles of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip. And I remind you, the entire Gaza Strip, 141 square miles, and roughly 400 miles of tunnels. Those tunnels were divided into those attack tunnels and those strategic tunnels. One of the also sort of interesting facets of the war is that there is no military strategy for dealing with such an array of tunnels. In all of the Western armies that have fought wars over the years, this is a new type of warfare. And Israel, the Israeli military, had to literally write the book on so how do you fight in such tunnels? Some of these tunnels are booby trapped. Some of these tunnels have weapons manufacturing areas. Some of them have hostages. Some of them have fighters. They have fake doors. They have blast doors. What do you do? The IDF created an entire unit aimed at learning how to fight in the tunnels. They did that very, very methodically. And that is the reason why you don't hear about the tunnels as much anymore. Because at the beginning of the war, this was among, like October 7th, a shock for the Israeli military. How do we deal with this? Now it's something when there's a tunnel discovered, there's already an advanced protocol of how to deal with it, how to go into it so you know it's not an ambush, how to try to check if there's hostages in there, not always perfectly. And we know that hostages have been killed in tunnels, both by the IDF and by Hamas when the IDF came close. So again, not perfectly, but there's much more of a protocol. So that's why you hear about the tunnels less right now. With regards to the operation of water flooding and how to stop these tunnels, the Israeli military looked into that and they did an experiment with flooding one of the tunnels. They actually discovered that it's entirely impractical. Among others, in order to bring in enough water, these tunnels are underground. That means that the water can be absorbed. In order to bring enough water to actually flood a tunnel and make sure it's not usable, you have to set up such a piping array that goes all the way to the sea or all the way to back to Israel. And in the midst of fighting, it's just impractical. And they also found that that's not going to make the tunnel not usable anymore. You flood it, okay, but eventually the water is going to seep into the ground, even if it takes a year, and the tunnel will become usable again. The military did do an experiment with a different type of chemical compound in a tunnel in Beit Hanun that is in the northern areas of the Gaza Strip. They published footage of this. I put this on my website. It's called the Israel-Palestine Report. They published footage of this where they showed that they were attempting to use a new material. They didn't say what it was, so I don't actually know, but they showed that there was new material that looked like a composition of something that was going to become maybe concrete, maybe something hard that would make the tunnels ineffective. But they also said it was a very expensive operation. So with regards to what is the situation of the tunnels right now, most of them that in the areas that the military has been operating have been cleared out by the military, but most of them have not been destroyed because I think possibly they're waiting until the war is over and they can do this more effectively, or possibly just realize that's impractical. They've been detonated, they've been buried, but they haven't used that mechanism or the flooding mechanism quite as much, mostly because it's just impractical, they found during the war.
Let's talk about the news of the day. We've spent a lot of time talking about the past 2 years, the history leading up to the October 7th attack. But we're standing today in the middle of pretty high stakes negotiations taking place in Cairo. What are we hearing out of Cairo? Are we hearing positive or negative things? Does it seem like things are on the right track, or are things unclear at this hour?
We're hearing everything. We are
Hmm.
hearing, on the one hand, that there are some advances that have been made. And I'll say it differently. I'll start differently. There's been 2 days of negotiations. In the first day of negotiations, the sides met, and reportedly that day went well. That day was not meant for any negotiations. That day was meant in order to build a framework for how they're going to negotiate. When they're negotiating, first of all, Israel and Hamas refuse to meet each other. So literally, it's something that is almost comical. They sit in one room, the Israeli delegation, the Hamas delegation sits in another room, and the emissaries from Qatar, Egypt, and the United States pass messages from side to side because they refuse to sit in the same room together. So that unto itself takes time, and they have to work out the mechanism for doing this. Usually, what they do is they break off into several different subcommittees. So there is a committee that is now going to negotiate the hostage exchange and the Palestinian prisoners, and then they're going to go set up somewhere, and they'll be the mediators. There's a committee that's going to negotiate the IDF withdrawal, and they're going to go set that up. So in the first day, that's all they set up. They set up how negotiations are going to proceed. In the second day, according to reports, they started to actually talk. On the one hand, there has been optimism that has been sort of emanating from the different negotiators. I'll say not from Israel and Hamas, but from Qatar, Egypt, some of the United States, Turkey have said things are going well. We are moving forward. The Egyptian foreign minister went as far as to say, maybe even by this Friday, we will have concluding the first part of the deal. In addition to that, from the optimism side, you asked me last week, how will we know if these talks are serious or not? And one of the things I said is it depends who's going. Is it low-level delegates or higher-level delegates? Well, after the meeting started with lower-level delegates, today the higher-level joined. Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner from the United States, from Israel, Minister Ron Dermer, from Hamas, Khalil Haya, from Qatar, the Prime Minister Mohammed Athani. They're all arriving today, tomorrow. That's an indication that talks are getting more serious. So all that's on the optimistic side. On the pessimistic side, coming out more from Israel and Hamas, we're seeing pessimism. Hamas has said that they are going to insist that there be changes in the framework of the 20-point plan because they want to tie the release of hostages to the final Israeli withdrawal. In the 20-point plan, the hostages are supposed to be released within 72 hours, and Israel will withdraw to the first phase, and then will continue. Hamas has said no, they want the withdrawal to be tied to the release of hostages. Probably they're not going to get that exactly, but that is something that they've put forward. Hamas has also said, one of the things I told you, that we're going to have a complicated situation with regards to which Palestinian prisoners are released. Hamas put forth their demands. Marwan Barghouti, Ahmad Sadat, Hassan Salameh, all of the top heaviest Palestinian prisoners Hamas is demanding. Israel has said, absolutely not. So from what Israel and Hamas are saying, they're not saying, they're not being pessimistic, but the terms that they're putting out there are things that still put up a lot of hurdles to the deal. Everyone else is being optimistic. Something that I do just have to tie in. It sounds a little bit cynical, but it is something that has to be considered. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee is meeting this Friday. It is meeting this Friday. We know that Trump has been nominated. We know that Trump historically has really wanted to get that prize. And that is one of the reasons that when the Egyptian foreign minister and the Turkish foreign minister and Qatar, when they're all out there saying everything's going great, it's going to be done by Friday, I cannot disassociate that with the fact that they probably know that Trump wants to hear that. That doesn't mean that that's not true, but they probably know that Trump wants to hear that. And that's also one of the things that I'm reading with, on the one hand, all of the countries around saying it's all going great and it's all going to be done by Friday. And Israel and Hamas, meanwhile, saying, we're talking, it's not all going great yet.
So, Alone, I think a lot of people, and by the way, we're getting this live feed, and we do work with streams from all across the globe. This is from Rio. This is a pro-Palestinian rally. You see some Stop the Genocide signage. This is not only a Rio type of protest. We've been seeing protests of this nature all across the globe. Looks like the shot might be freezing on us. A live look at Gaza, the time about 15 minutes past midnight, Israel Standard Time. Let's ask a question while we're talking about the humanitarian challenges. Jerry in Edinburgh asks, what extent and type of humanitarian aid has the IDF provided to Gazan citizens in the last 2 years? What's been the story? What's been the ebbs and flows of the humanitarian challenges and the amount of aid making it into the enclave over the past 2 years?
So I'll start to answer this, but Austin, if I go too far or too long, just tell me to stop, because questions and the stories of the humanitarian aid in this war are very
You
complex
do your
and they're
thing.
very long. Starting from before the war, on October 6, 2023, when everything was quote unquote okay in the Gaza Strip, up to 500 aid trucks came into Gaza each day. That is an indication of the level of poverty in Gaza, the level of dysfunctionality of the Hamas led government, and the level of aid that was required. So that was before the war, no humanitarian, no internal displacement, no bombings. What we had is 500 aid trucks coming in per day. When the war started, Israel announced it is going to stop the humanitarian aid that is coming into Gaza, and that was the situation for the first couple of months, first couple of weeks, and then Israel allowed a trickle of aid that increased a little bit with the different hostage deals, and I'll talk about what happened next. But with regards to the way this question has been worded by Jerry, the one thing I want to say is the IDF itself does not provide does not provide humanitarian aid. Israel has not provided any humanitarian aid to Gaza. Israel controls what humanitarian aid comes in. That's important. That's important because, on the one hand, internal politics within the Israeli government, Israeli prime minister said Israel will not provide aid to the Palestinians in Gaza, and has lived up to that word on the one hand. On the other hand, that is part of the major international criticism that Israel is the one that sort of sits on the gates of if aid can come in, but is not providing aid itself. So that's in terms of who provides the aid. In terms of the amount of aid that came in, like I said, in the first weeks, it was just a trickles, 2 trucks a day. Then, after the first hostage deal, it increased to 200 trucks a day. But then we started to see a lot of international pressure at the beginning of 2024. As a result of a few different things that happened in the Gaza Strip, there was a complete breakdown of the distribution of aid, and the fighting also cut off all the aid going into northern Gaza. And we started to see for the first time there were talks about famine in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. And then Israel came under monumental pressure from the world, and specifically from the United States President Biden at that time. And Israel allowed aid to come in. It allowed air paradropping missions. It allowed the sea corridor to come in from Cyprus. It allowed aid to flow in through Israel from Jordan and through the port of Ashdod. And that was the situation then for a good 6 months or so. Then we had, again, a spiral of fighting in September, October. And then we had the deal at the beginning of 2025 where there was also 600 aid trucks coming in per day. During that time, a lot of aid was coming in and it was being distributed a lot more effectively. What ended up happening is that when that ceasefire at the beginning of 2025 broke down, on March 2nd, Israel cut off all humanitarian aid coming into the Gaza Strip. So between March 2nd and May 18th, for over 2 months, there was no food, no clean water, and no medical supplies that were allowed into the Gaza Strip. We did not see the effect of that immediately, but starting April, we started to see more and more reports of conditions of hunger, conditions of famine, people dying of malnutrition. And that was the situation until May. Starting in May, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was established by the United States and very likely with the support of Israel. And then we saw a little bit of an increase in the aid going to northern Gaza as well. But the situation has really fluctuated since then. So it's very difficult to say what has Israel done with regards to aid, because it's varied a lot throughout the war. We have seen food coming in, we've seen water coming in, we've seen medical supplies coming in, not from Israel, but through Israel coming into the Gaza Strip. At the same time, there's also been a lot of criticism because Israel has stopped aid from coming in, stopped certain amounts of aid from coming in. And the charges, and this is something we haven't talked about yet, the international charges against Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel's former defense minister Yoav Gallant, among others, in the International Criminal Court, one of the main charges has been using starvation as a method of war. That is illegal according to international law. And that is one of the things that Israel has been charged with, or the leaders have been charged with, because aid entry has been tied to the release of hostages, tied to the deals with Hamas. And according to international law, and right or wrong, it's a fact, according to international law, aid is supposed to be allowed into conflict zones by the country that controls the territory, which is Israel, because it controls all of the borders. So with that, Israel is saying it's allowed tons of aid to come into the Gaza Strip: food, water, medical supplies, shelters. The world is saying, yes, but not only has it not been enough, it has been used strategically as a method of war to entice Hamas to release hostages, and that is illegal. So that's the very complex answer to the question on humanitarian aid.
And we appreciate sometimes this stuff requires a lot of context in order to fully get the picture. Let's move back to the attack itself. 2 years ago today, Joseph from Ojai asks this question. And you mentioned this earlier in the hour alone, but if you can't expand on it, please. Why was Israel caught off guard by the October 7th attack? What is it that allowed Hamas to do what it did 2 years ago?
Well, that's the big question that everyone in Israel and almost around the world was asking right when that attack happened. And still 2 years later, I will say that the Israeli government has refused to set up what's called a national commission of inquiry in order to investigate this. So we don't actually have an official investigation in Israel as to what actually precipitated the complete intelligence failure. And that is also a very political matter that in Israel, the government has refused to establish that. A lot of suspicion that because of fears of the prime minister, but again, that's all rumors. When it comes to what actually happened on the ground, there is a conflation of several different things that came together in order to lead to that colossal intelligence failure. On the ground, as far as the Israeli military and the Shabak, what appears to be is simply being asleep on the job. What we saw throughout the war, what we saw in Iran, what we saw in Lebanon, is that where the intelligence agencies, and specifically then it was the Mossad, invest in thinking there's a danger, Hezbollah, Iran, the Israeli intelligence community is still very, very effective. Seemingly, it just thought that Gaza was placated. It just thought that Hamas is not going to want to do this. Hamas had been carrying out massive training operations, and in Israel, this was constantly sold as yes, but this is just a show for their own people. So, as far as the intelligence community is concerned, it was simply a lot less invested into what's happening in the Gaza Strip. And Israel had also relegated a lot of the surveillance around Gaza to technology. It had pulled out a lot of troops from the areas around the border of Gaza and had given in to cameras, monitoring equipment on the ground. And Hamas knew this. Hamas had worked on their own intelligence. The first thing they did in the October 7th attack is they sent drones, what's called suicide drones, to crash into all of the IDF's guard towers that had cameras on them. The result being the Israeli military had no idea what was coming. So that's in terms of on the ground, the failure of the military and the failure of the intelligence community. In addition to that, two more things I'll say. One is the West Bank at that point was also flaring up. The West Bank had been a hotbed for many, many years, but specifically since the entrance of the new government in Israel, Israel had been making a lot of public statements about annexing the West Bank, about developing settlements in the West Bank, and that required the Israeli military to invest more troops physically in the West Bank rather than in Gaza. But if I take a step back and I look more broadly from from what was happening on the ground to the was known as a conception within the Israeli government, the perception was that Hamas has been bought off. Hamas worked very, very hard to
Oh,
convince the Israeli government that they do not want any more fighting. That Hamas, despite its rhetoric, despite its ideology, despite its building up power, actually is happy to just control the Gaza Strip. And they did this through clandestine messages that were sent to the Israeli government. They did this by not participating actively when there were flare ups between Israel and groups in Gaza since 2021. It was Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hamas strategically did not participate. And we learned in retrospect because they were trying to lull Israel into this false sense of security. So we had the Israeli government that assumed that Hamas is placated, and Hamas, again, like I said, was being bought off with money. Israel was allowing Qatar to flood Hamas with millions of dollars in order to buy silence, so to speak. And then you had the Israeli military also being given this perception that Hamas is placated and giving into technology. Both those things came and collided on October 7th, producing this. But like I said, cannot be overemphasized. October 7th went, quote unquote, far better than Hamas anticipated. According to the Hamas troops themselves, the Nukhba fighters, They anticipated the Israeli military to be waiting for them. The reason that the Hamas, for example, spread their troops out thin, they didn't concentrate them in one area. They blew more than 80 holes in the fence was because they said, we know that the Israeli, all powerful Israeli military is going to be waiting for us. We need to spread our forces out thin, and then a second wave will determine where maybe we can get through. They all got through. They ended up kidnapping many more people than they even expected. That was one of the reasons when the hostage deal of 2023, why Hamas demanded even less than they might have been able to, because they needed to get rid of some of these. They did not expect to do so well, quote unquote, on October 7th. The extent of failure within Israel shocked even Hamas itself.
So let's talk about the hostages. By the way, we just showed this for a moment. This is a live feed out of Buenos Aires, Argentina. This is a hostage rally taking place. Just moments ago, we saw some of the people here, the demonstrators, holding up photos of hostages that remain in captivity. We also are hearing from Caroline Levitt. She's the White House press secretary. She says, on the second anniversary of October 7th, President Trump met with Idan Alexander and his family and the family of Omer Nutra, whose body is still in Gaza. That's something that some people may not understand alone, is there's not only living hostages in Gaza, there's also, sadly, the bodies of hostages that haven't been returned as well. What do we need to know about where the hostage situation stands today? This is the last question I'll ask you before I know you have to take off. Tell us about the number of people that we understand are still in captivity. Talk about the bodies, if you will, and talk about the idea of living hostages being in Gaza City while the IDF is moving in to Gaza City.
So I'll take a step back. A total of 251 people were kidnapped on October 7th. And there's often some confusion because some people say 251, some people say 255. That is because there were already four people in the Gaza Strip. Two of them were IDF soldiers who had been killed in 2014 and their bodies were held by Hamas. And two of them were Israeli civilians who had been held by Hamas through various different mechanisms for years. So that's why there were a total of 255 after that, but 251 were kidnapped on October 7th. One of the factors is already of those 251, 44 were bodies. People that were killed in the October 7th attack, and Hamas kidnapped their bodies back to the Gaza Strip. So already then, there were people who had been killed, and it was just their bodies that was being held by Hamas in captivity. Since then, 39 hostages were also killed in captivity. Some of these were executed by Hamas. Some of these were killed by the IDF directly. Three of them had escaped, but the IDF mistook them for Palestinians and gunned them down. And three of them were also killed in a tunnel that the IDF bombed. And then 133 were released in different deals. And there's also been rescues. The IDF managed to rescue 8 live hostages and retrieve the bodies of just over 40 hostages. So that is the total picture when it comes to numbers, leaving us right now with 48 hostages in the Gaza Strip. Of those 48, there is some conflict between seemingly Israel and US President Trump about how many of them are alive. Israel considers 20 of them are alive, and the rest are dead. The rest are dead, and their bodies are held by Hamas. Either they are people who died in captivity, or they are people who had been killed on October 7th. So what Israel is negotiating for is 20 living hostages and the bodies of the remaining hostages. However, over the last month, US President Trump has said time and again, and that's important, it's not just, a slip of the tongue that sometimes leaders, and specifically Trump, can do. It time and again has said that more hostages are dead. He has time and again said that there are 38 to 40 hostages that are dead. He has said that there are 20 that are alive, but actually a few have been killed recently. Israel is publicly saying they don't know why Trump is saying this. So maybe Trump has access to information that we don't have with regards to the hostages. Maybe Israel's not being completely forthcoming, but it does know. We don't know. But the official numbers right now that's being negotiated is 20 living hostages and then 28 hostages whose bodies are held by Hamas, but possibly more, and we just don't know about that yet. With regards to the fact that hostages may be in Gaza City, Hamas has said that it has at least 8 hostages, living hostages, in Gaza City, in the areas that the IDF is moving into. It has said it's not going to evacuate them. This is an attempt to compel Israel to stop the bombings. Israel did not stop the bombings until Trump ordered Israel to stop the bombings. And this does put hostages at risk. We know from hostages that were returned in different deals that they were in tunnels that were bombed out. They had to be rescued by their captors, ironically, rescued from the tunnels by their Al Qassam Hamas captors because they had been buried in the tunnels. So that is part of the complexity of fighting the war. That is a lot of the criticism within Israel of the way the war is being run, that there's this emphasis on destroying Hamas as opposed to rescuing the hostages. But obviously, it's a push and pull. Hamas knows this, so they put the hostages in harm's way. That's the push and pull at the moment.
Going back to this live feed from Argentina, where it looks like some of the programming is getting underway. You see the images of hostages behind them at this event. It is time for Alon to step away. We're going to continue streaming. We have Hal Kempfer coming on in a moment. But Alon, before you go, you're the host of the Israel-Palestine Report on YouTube. Let everybody that's watching know where they can find you, what's on your channel, any plug you deem fit.
Thank you. Ever since the war started, my field of research in academia is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And ever since the war started, I started recording summaries of what's happening in the war. My aim there is basically to try to give some clarity because everyone gets different news feeds. So I take the different news reports from Israel, Palestinian sources, Arab sources, international sources, and try to make sense of what is actually happening on the ground in Gaza and what's happening politically. I upload summaries once or twice a week with regards to what's happening in the war. I'm also doing a live stream of that tonight. So if you are interested in more content on the war, feel free to look up Israel-Palestine Report or Alon Burstein on YouTube, and I hope to see you there.
Alon, we always appreciate you. Alon joins us often on air here to lend some critical context to this very complex topic. Good to see you, Alon. Thanks.
Thank you, and nice to see you, Hal.
Yes, Hal
Good to
Kempfer
see
is
you,
here
Alon.
with us as well. Let's bring Hal in. Hal, can you hear me and can we hear you?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
All right. Alon, we thank you for your time. Hal Kempfer is going to close out the final half hour with us. Good to see you, sir. We are we've been doing this for 90 minutes at this point, Hal. You're joining us, and what I want to do is hit some U.S. angles with you. Hal is a retired Marine intelligence officer and the host of the Strat podcast. You can listen to Strat anywhere podcasts are available. We've been showing some questions from viewers, including this. What do we, the U.S., benefit from supporting / participating in or ending this war? I think a lot of Americans have that question, Hal. Why are we so tied up in this? Why are we as involved as we are?
You know, that's interesting. You asked that the the viewer asked that, Austin, because that's been a question that's come up, I think, since the beginning of Israel. That there's always been a part of the body politic out there that says, why do we do these things for Israel? Why do we support Israel? Why do we? Because it's a flashpoint, obviously. There's Arab countries, very large Arab countries around it that are focused, that have been historically focused on Israel, the destruction of Israel, and they have a lot of oil and a lot of economic power. And the question is, why do we do this? And I think part of it's a moral obligation coming out of World War II. The horrors of what we saw in the Holocaust, and also it makes sense. One thing that Israel has done is develop into being a strategic ally that is basically unsurpassed within the region. It has the only functional democracy in the region, which I think is really, really, that's a substantial thing. There's other parts of it, the area that have elections and stuff, but nothing like the politics of Israel. So it really is a bastion of democracy in a region that doesn't have a lot of democratic traditions with a lot of the countries in there. The other thing is, it is a powerhouse, and it is amazing what Israel has done with a relatively small area of land since the late 40s. I mean, it is a technological powerhouse. It is a academic powerhouse, and of course, the one thing more that really everyone sees is it is a military powerhouse. Not only do they have a powerful military, they have a powerful defense or military industrial complex. that puts out first order weapons, whether it's in the air, on the ground, whatever. And as we have seen, certainly in the last 2 years, they dominate the battlefield. There is no country in the region that can do what Israel does as far as military throw weight, if you will, at any conflict. So there's a lot of reasons why we ally with Israel and why we support Israel. At times, though, historically speaking, not just now. I mean, President Trump kind of put Netanyahu his back up against the wall, so to speak, and said, "Hey, look, stop bombing Gaza." And we saw that Netanyahu stopped the bombing in Gaza. Now, with that said, once the Sunday deadline had kind of gone and passed, and the negotiations are dragging on, Israel appears to be still bombing in Gaza. It's just not doing offensive operations, reducing block by block, building by building in Gaza City, but it is still doing offensive operations elsewhere in and around Gaza City in there. And so there are times, and Eisenhower certainly had some issues with Israel in the Suez crisis, and Nixon had some issues with Israel, and after the '73 war, and there have been times where U.S. and Israel probably aren't seeing completely eye to eye, but the commitment that the U.S. has had to maintain Israel, to help safeguard Israel, has always remained steadfast. Although at times we disagree on policy and tactics on how that's done, but we remain that steadfast, I would say indispensable ally for Israel.
We're getting this question in from Graham in South Carolina. If Hamas denies hostage release, will Trump deploy troops? That's been a question. President Trump has basically threatened Hamas and said, well, if we don't move in an expeditious manner here on a path toward peace and a hostage release, you might have the exact language in your mind. I don't have the exact language in my mind, but Trump has not been shy about saying that they will, in some way, shape, or form, rain hell down on Gaza. So what are the U.S.'s options if
I don't actually think that we would put troops in Gaza itself. First off, they're not needed. The IDF has more than enough troops to do what they intend to do, what they are currently doing. U.S. troops, it creates tremendous command and control issues. Obviously, there's tremendous political issues, political potential, enormous political backblast, in the Arab world and elsewhere if we were to introduce troops in there. Also, I'm not sure that we have a truly vested interest. One time there was, American citizens as hostages. Well, do we really need to do that? What is the statement we're making? Is there that critical need now? And so I don't think you'll see that. Now, as far as us raining holy hell down, the question would be, how would we do that? What can we do? What can we provide that the Israeli defense forces can't actually do themselves? They fly aircraft that we built. They drop bombs that we provide them. They have pretty much, I think, everything they need to prosecute the operation that's before them. So I'm not quite sure what exactly the holy hell is that we would rain down on. I mean, maybe we could do more intelligence sharing. I'm not sure if we're really withholding anything that we know about what's going on in Gaza from the Israelis, and that might help them with some target intelligence. But I really don't see what additional firepower or throw weight that we need to put into this conflict that the Israelis can't do themselves. I see a whole lot of reasons why we don't want to put boots on the ground in Gaza Strip, and I think that we will maintain those reasons. And President Trump, historically speaking, has not wanted to put boots on the ground in a lot of places. So I just don't see him wanting to, in the political calculus, wanting to do something like that unless there was just some clear and overwhelming imperative need. And I just don't see that need.
Let's get to Alexis from Friendswood. Alexis asks, in the event the remaining hostages are released, what's the next step to end the war? I guess, what's the exit strategy, she asks. Hal?
The interesting, that is really an interesting thing to ponder. They're negotiating right now on the phase one extensively. Phase one is the release of the hostages and, of course, the release of Palestinian prisoners that Israel holds. That is phase one. One of the big sticking points in that is how far will Israel withdraw its forces? There are a series of lines in the map that Israel has within the Gaza Strip. They say, we'll pull our forces back here, you release the hostages, then we pull back to here. And it all presumes, that there's another peacekeeping authority or peacekeeping force that comes in from Arab countries or something, and it presumes that there's an actual technocratic Palestinian governing entity that would step in and do these things. And all of these are still being negotiated. So there's a possibility that the hostages get released and that things stall. The right now Hamas is saying they're back to square one. They're saying we want a complete Israeli Defense Force withdrawal, all Israeli military withdrawal from all the Gaza Strip, and only then will we release the hostages. And that's just simply not going to happen. Nobody believes them. Nobody takes them at their word that they would do that. And of course, Israel is not going to give up all that terrain just to have to go in and retake it when Hamas reneges on what they're supposed to do. So that's just simply not going to happen. So there is a possibility they could maybe finish phase one, get the hostages released, and then maybe phase two, with the whatever this technocratic Palestinian governing entity does not quite come through. The Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and others aligned with them do not fully disarm. They do not agree to, step aside completely from governance. And in that situation, then it would be back to a pitched fight. But the ground has changed. While everything is going on, it doesn't make a lot of headlines, but it makes some. Israel has been working with other groups, other Palestinian groups in the Gaza Strip. There is a lot, they can't get an accurate poll, but there is a lot of frustration, anger with Hamas amongst the Palestinian residents. And there are other groups that have kind of temporarily allied themselves, if you will, with Israel in trying to get rid of Hamas. So what you might see is Israel maintains military contact while there is also some interscene warfare within the Gaza Strip, within the Palestinian groups themselves. And you may see the Palestinians going in there and basically reducing Hamas's presence while Israel kind of provides a larger strategic force in present, force that's there. But there's a lot of different, there's not a lot, but there's a few different possibilities, course of action that could take place depending on how this thing rolls out.
The reason why we're doing this stream is because today marks 2 years since the October 7th attack. That's the terrorist attack that sparked this current iteration of the Israel-Hamas war. I want to ask you a question that I asked Cliff in Alone earlier on in the broadcast. You've done so many media interviews like this over the past 2 years covering this conflict, Hal. Is there a question or is there a topic that you feel like would be asked more often? What comes to mind?
Actually, the one that seems to pop up is the one that actually you asked alone, and I thought that really hits it, which gets to the failure of October 7th. And when I look at October 7th, and it's been compared, the Israeli 9/11, if you will, and if you look at the numbers, comparatively speaking, but if you look at the ratio in terms of U.S. population to Israeli population stuff, in many ways, one could say the impact was much bigger on Israel in terms of loss of life and everything else than comparatively to the U.S. But I do not want to in any way diminish the horror that happened on 9/11. Okay, that was a change in my life, obviously, and I spent a lot of time and traveled a lot of miles and went to a lot of different places because of that. But what I would point out is there is one fundamental thing. First off, Alone does talk about the intelligence failure. And yes, it was an intelligence failure. I would say it was intelligence, surveillance, maybe even reconnaissance failure across the board. But I really think it kind of goes to the issue we had with 9/11 here in the US. It was really a failure of imagination. And in some ways, it was a failure of different parts of the government, different security agencies to work together. Much has been said about the failures of the FBI and the CIA to share critical intelligence on Al Qaeda before 9/11. Well, you're also seeing some things where intelligence analysis saying, hey, look, the threat is coming, wasn't really shaping any significant decisions to change the security posture or preparedness stance around the Gaza Strip. And there certainly was a lot there to indicate that Hamas was getting ready to do something. And I really think it was I don't think it's less an intelligence failure than a decision-making failure. And I will say that historically, and of course, as a as a retired intelligence officer, as a former senior intelligence officer stationed in the Middle East, that I would say that many times decision failures by the decision makers who are usually the top, the top of the pyramid, if you will, it's very easy to say, well, it's an intelligence failure with the idea that somehow we could walk in there with a crystal ball and predict the future for them. When in reality is the world is very messy. You're never going to get an absolute clarity on what's going to happen tomorrow, but you've got to make timely decisions and you've got to do things in bureaucracies, which can be a single agency or a multi-agency bureaucracy. They don't tend to be very flexible and adaptive and change. So I think what's kind of happened around the Gaza Strip is you saw a very extensive security setup, intelligence collection setup. But I think the Israelis got a little complacent in what they have. They weren't testing their system. They weren't thinking. They weren't aggressively thinking like the bad guy, if you will. They weren't aggressively thinking like what would Hamas do, and weighing in all those factors of what is affecting Hamas. Probably definitely not weighing in the factors of what happens if Saudi Arabia normalizes relation with Israel. What would Hamas do? And in that, I think it was probably a bigger decision failure than it was an intelligence failure. I'm saying it wasn't, there was intelligence shortfalls, but I think that's one of the things that's going to come out of this. And we need to be ready for that because look, it's been 24 years, since 9/11. That is a long time. There are many that are in the strategic risk management world who are saying we're going to get hit with something here and it's going to be big and we don't know what it is. And I think one of the things that should have been a wake up call, the pandemic. And there was plenty out there saying that we would have a big pandemic. And frankly, our preparedness and our response left a lot to be desired. So I think we need to take heed of what just happened there and incorporate that in some of our thinking here.
Let's talk about the destruction in Gaza. People have seen these images. These images have become common over the past 2 years. These are more recent images showing the wide swath of destruction. You can see some of the tent cities that have been built. And then we've, of course, been covering the displacement of Palestinian civilians. For many of them, it's happened multiple times, major displacements. A live look at Gaza, by the way, where the time, Israel Standard Time, is about 48 minutes past midnight. So, Hal, final question I'm going to pose to you from one of our viewers, Linda in Massachusetts, sending this in, and it has to do with rebuilding some of the rubble that we just looked at. Where will Gaza get money to build homes once the war is over? How much clarity do we have on that question?
We don't have a lot, although it is frequently kind of sort of vaguely said that the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and maybe some of the other Gulf states will come up with funding to help rebuild Gaza. The question is, what will they want in return for rebuilding Gaza? And that could reshape what Gaza is. And there's, I don't know if they're just going to, write a blank check and say, here, go build Gaza. They'll probably want something where they have control of how that money's spent, and they may want some sort of return on investment. And I will say this because, look, the Saudis, the Emiratis, they are shrewd business executives, and they know, are businessmen across the board, I should say, and they know and understand the concept of real estate development, if you will, of capital investment and various things. And so it'll be a change to Gaza. It will not be what it was. It will, there'll be a lot of, probably a lot more corporate ownership of land there, I would imagine, or buildings. That would be my guess because of the investment capital need to rebuild it. But it will be, at the end of it, it'll be a new Gaza. It'll be very different. It'll be, you have new construction, modern construction. I wouldn't be surprised if you see some things being introduced here, such as, basically building homes through robotic means, as they used to, it's the famous 3D printed homes, but there's been some rapid advancements in that area. And I look at that, and there's already been some discussion, which is that's a technology that could be adapted towards, more cost effectively rebuilding the homes throughout Gaza. So we might see some really amazing things happen in terms of rebuilding it. But as far as the society in Gaza, I think that's going to be forever changed to some extent. There's no going back to before October 7th. This is a traumatic, emotional, psychological, not to mention physically damaging event that's happened to that entire society. So it's going to change, and I would imagine Gaza may become much more international when it's all said. Now it's just primarily Palestinian residents, but I could see with all that investment capital, everything else coming in, that it could really be much more of an international location, which kind of reminds me a little bit of what the UAE became. With all the investment that went into the UAE, that is very much like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, very much international cities. And we might see something like that, in Gaza City or something in the future.
I'll ask you, just to wrap up here, where do things go from here? I'll ask you a big one. What are you watching for? Obviously, as we have this discussion, it just happens to be on the cusp of some incredibly high stakes meetings taking place in Cairo. What are the common threads and what are the biggest threads that you're following this week? And what are you looking for months from now, I suppose, even into 2026, Hal? We've talked for the past hour and a half about a lot of big picture ideas. So what are you looking ahead to in the immediate term? What are you looking ahead to in the bigger picture?
The immediate term thing, the biggest thing I see with Gaza is can they get the hostages released? That's first and foremost. If they can get that done, that changes the dynamic. With that said, Hamas loses one of its biggest leverage points of leverage, if you will, that there's nothing that really holds the IDF back from going in there and finishing the job of eliminating Hamas should Hamas not decide to take the next step, which is disarmament and stepping aside from a governance role and providing the space for this, whatever this governing authority, transitional governing authority coming in, allowing it to establish and operate. And there's a lot of reasons to think that we could get through that phase one. We could see a partial withdrawal of Israeli forces, and things just do not proceed as planned, and it kind of reverts back to not where we are now, but something that looks much more like armed conflict, and that's very possible. So I'm going to see that first phase one thing to see if they could just get through that phase one thing, and then as I'm looking out towards going up to 2026, can they do the phase two? Can they disarm? Well, three things: can they disarm Hamas and PIJ? Can they set up this governance and peacekeeping force, if you will, or capability within the Gaza Strip? And then the probably just as co-equal to the others, can they figure out a sustainable aid and housing and everything else package for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip? They've just been moving back and forth. They live in these just improvised tent things. Something much more substantial has to be done. I'm not talking about the eventual reconstruction. I'm just talking about something in the short term where they can be put in sustainable quarters with enough food, medical aid, everything else, clean water, sanitation, that they can survive while everything else is taking place in the Gaza Strip.
Approaching 1 a.m. Israel Standard Time. We've been focusing on this live view of Gaza. This is a camera that's planted in southern Israel, and it overlooks a portion of the Gaza skyline. I don't know how easy it is to see on your end, Hal, but there's been a good amount of blasts that we saw while you were just talking. There's also a plume of smoke. It's dark out. It's a little tough to make some of these things out. But let's just put a pin in this before we go. To your understanding, what type of action is happening on the battlefield? Of course, the IDF has said it's moved to a defensive position. So these blasts that we're seeing live on TV right now, we don't have anything immediately to report exactly as to what exactly is being targeted. Of course, that comes later. But for now, Hal, what's your understanding of what's happening on the battlefield tonight?
My understanding is that the Israeli Defense Forces have stopped offensive operations into Gaza City itself. All right, that's where they've stopped. Now, what they seem to have done and there seemed to be a kind of an operational pause with all offensive operations, but they seem to have said, okay, we will not continue to do that block by block, street by street fighting in Gaza City, but around Gaza City, they're continuing to do offensive operations. And I also and this is one where I'm still waiting for more reporting on this, but I think as they see Hamas or PIJ targets of opportunity that could be within the city, that if there's something, they will make a decision whether it is worth the, whatever they will get. And keep in mind, this is a self-imposed, movement to defensive operations. This is not something that's part of an agreement. There is no ceasefire. There is nothing. This is something that Israel said we will do. Yes, they had tremendous pressure from the Trump White House, but they said we will do this. But if they see something where I think that they could take out a really high value target in Gaza City, I would not be surprised if they would take that opportunity. If there's anything Hamas or PIJ is doing around Gaza City or anywhere else in the Gaza Strip, yeah, that's free game. I mean, it's a terrible way to put it, but that's something that they can do. It's they have not said they're stopping there, and it is a it is a military operation, and they are not shy about making it very clear to everyone. This is a military operation. That's part of the negotiation strategy, is to keep the military pressure on to force Hamas to realize it cannot prevail.
Hal Kempfer is a retired Marine intelligence officer, national security analyst, and the host of the Strat podcast. Where can people listen to Strat, Hal?
Pretty much everywhere. Captivate, Apple, anywhere you can get your podcast. You can also go to strappodcast.com. And I will tell you that it's a busy world. Some weeks we talk about the Middle East. A lot of weeks we talk about Russia, Ukraine. And then, of course, we also talk about this little issue of the National Guard deploying in major cities in the U.S.
Hal Kempfer being generous with his time, as always, today. Hal, good to see you. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Austin.
That's going to wrap up our special coverage today. We thank you for watching along this afternoon. A little bit of a different format than we typically do. I will be on the desk later on this evening. The plan is to use pieces of this 2-hour conversation that I had with so many of our experts. And we do appreciate not only Hal, we appreciate Alon Burstein's time tonight, and we appreciate Cliff May's time tonight. You can check out Alon's work. He is the host of the Israel-Palestine Report on YouTube. Cliff May, he's the president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. You can listen to Hal's Strat podcast anywhere podcasts are available. One thing I'm going to show you before we go off the air, I'm going to do a little bit more coverage tonight. Today marks 2 years since the October 7th attack. If you want to send in any of your questions, there's a possibility we do more of this tonight, live on TV. Scan that QR code, go to the Ask Now tab. Once you hit the Ask Now tab, that's how you can submit your questions, and then you very well may see your question posed to one of our experts later on this evening. And if QR codes aren't your thing, you can also just go to livenowfox.com/connect. It'll take you to the very same webpage. Again, once you land on that webpage, you're going to want to hit the Ask Now tab in order to submit your questions. We thank you for watching this special stream, and I'll be on the desk starting at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Pacific Time on our regular Live Now broadcast. Thanks for watching. I'm going to leave you with this shot of the Gaza skyline We're going to be ending the stream in a moment here. Thank you all for watching.